The breaking point everyone thought would never come in the Strait of Hormuz may finally have arrived. In the world's most dangerous waterway, where one miscalculation can shake the entire global economy, the United States has now made a move so large, so deliberate, and so dangerous that it signals something far bigger than a routine naval transit. On April 11th, two guided missile destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, passed through Hormuz. On the surface, that alone was dramatic. But those two warships were only the visible edge of a much larger operation. Right behind them comes the far more important part: the underwater drones, the mine-clearing systems, the surveillance web, and the opening phase of a campaign that may be designed not merely to protect transit, but to rewrite control over the entire strait. Because Washington is no longer acting like it is waiting for a solution. It is beginning to act like it intends to impose one. This transit was anything but quiet. As soon as the American destroyers entered the strait, they were tracked by naval units of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. Radio warnings followed almost immediately, including open declarations that this was the final warning. The Americans kept moving, insisting they were operating within international law and in line with ceasefire conditions. But the standoff did not remain verbal. At the peak of the tension, reports emerged that a drone linked to Iran had been destroyed by U.S. forces. Tehran then tried to shape the narrative in its own favor, officially denying that the passage had happened as described and claiming the ships had turned back after receiving the warning. Yet at the same time, the Iranian side also declared that from now on it would respond much more harshly to military units entering the strait. That contradiction says everything. Iran knows a line has been crossed. The problem for Tehran is that Washington appears fully aware of it too. The timing of this encounter is just as important as the encounter itself. It came immediately after 21 hours of negotiations in Pakistan ended without a definitive agreement. That failure matters. It means diplomacy has not yet produced a stable path toward reopening Hormuz under mutually accepted conditions. It also helps explain the language that followed from Washington. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance accused Iran of making a huge mistake, a phrase that may sound political on the surface, but likely reflects something far more serious happening behind closed doors. It suggests the United States may now be shifting from pressure and signaling toward operational preparation. In other words, the warships entering Hormuz were not just sending a message. They may have been the beginning of America's final effort to break the deadlock and force open one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet. What makes this so dangerous is that the greatest threat in Hormuz is no longer the one everybody can see. It is the one silently waiting below the surface. Iran's mining campaign has turned the strait into a floating death trap. The mines were laid quickly, irregularly, and in many cases crudely by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy units using small boats. That made the initial threat serious enough. But the situation has become even worse because many of those mines did not stay where they were placed. The Gulf's powerful bottom currents caught a significant number of them and dragged them away from their original positions. That means the map of the minefield is no longer reliable even to the side that created it. Moored contact mines, magnetic and acoustic mines, and drifting explosives are now believed to be scattered across a waterway so critical that roughly 1/5 of the world's oil trade must pass through it. Iran has not just mined Hormuz. It has lost control of the monster it created. That is why the passage of the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy matters so much. These are not ordinary ships. They are Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, armed with the Aegis combat system and capable of scanning and tracking threats across enormous distances. They are not dedicated mine hunters, and they were not sent simply to poke Iran or to make a symbolic transit. They were sent because Washington needed heavily defended floating fortresses to begin creating the conditions for a new safe route through the strait. Their mission was strategic. They were there to show presence, build confidence, map danger, and help lay the groundwork for a corridor that can eventually escort commercial shipping back into something resembling normal movement. The fact that 3 supertankers reportedly became among the first major vessels to cross Hormuz during the ceasefire period already suggests those first moves may be having an effect. The locks on the global oil trade are not fully broken yet, but they may be starting to crack. Still, this is only the beginning. The real work will not be done by the destroyers alone. It will be done by the high-tech autonomous underwater systems the United States is preparing to push into the Gulf. These unmanned underwater vehicles, particularly platforms like the Knife Fish, are designed for precisely this kind of mission. They can search silently through dangerous waters, identify mines, map threats, and help carve out narrow corridors where larger ships can move. In the days ahead, these underwater drones are expected to become the central tools in a mine-clearing process that could determine whether Hormuz returns to partial life or falls deeper into chaos. If they succeed, the world may soon see a picture that seemed impossible just days ago: a narrow but reliable shipping lane, clear enough for tankers to make the roughly 7-hour transit through the strait with some degree of confidence. But Washington's thinking now appears to go beyond mine clearance. President Donald Trump has been using increasingly sharp language, and his rhetoric suggests that the true American plan may be much broader than simply cleaning a passage. He indicated that the United States would open the strait even if it did not need to use it itself, making clear that Washington sees Hormuz not merely as an economic issue, but as a question of strategic authority. That is where the doctrine now being referred to in the media as the out blockade comes into focus. If Iran refuses to reopen Hormuz in a safe and predictable way, then the United States may move to establish its own control mechanism over the entrances and exits of the strait. This would not just mean escorting ships. It would mean building a structure in which the U.S. Navy effectively decides which ships can pass, which are stopped, which are searched, and which are denied movement altogether. That would be a dramatic escalation, because Hormuz is not simply a local dispute between Iran and the United States. It is the central artery through which around 20% of the global oil supply moves every day. If that artery remains blocked, unstable, or controlled by the logic of crisis, the consequences will not stop in the Gulf. They will radiate outward across Europe, Asia, and every economy dependent on secure energy flow. Europe's already fragile industrial base could take another major shock. Asian manufacturing powerhouses could face supply disruption, higher costs, and slowed output. Global inflation, already a deep structural concern, could climb further. The question of who controls Hormuz is therefore not just about warships and mines. It is about who gets to shape the economic rhythm of the modern world. If the out-blockade doctrine moves from rhetoric to reality, the military mechanics of it are already beginning to appear. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is on alert in the region. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, to which the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. is attached, holds enormous firepower in and around the Persian Gulf. If fighting intensifies again, F-35s and F divided by a -18S launch from the carrier could create a dense air umbrella over the strait, while destroyers and cruisers form a steel barrier at sea. In practical terms, the first phase of the operation would likely involve surgically opening a safe corridor through the most dangerous part of the strait, especially the narrow section that compresses shipping into a vulnerable bottleneck. Autonomous systems working below the surface would clear the path. Above and around them, American air and naval assets would secure the environment. If that phase succeeds, then escorted convoys of commercial tankers could begin to move again, perhaps restoring traffic to around 40% of normal flow. But if Iran continues to resist and the ceasefire collapses altogether, the second phase could be much harsher. Additional Arleigh Burke destroyers, Ticonderoga-class cruisers, and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft could be rushed in. At that point, the entrances and exits of Hormuz would stop looking like a crisis zone and start looking like a military checkpoint system on a regional scale. The U.S. Navy could then begin stopping, searching, rerouting, or blocking ships it considers suspicious. That would hit Iran directly and brutally, because it could choke off around 70% of Tehran's daily oil export capacity. In other words, the weapon Iran tried to use against the world could be turned back against Iran itself. If the regime insists on weaponizing the strait, Washington seems increasingly willing to make the regime pay for it in the most immediate way possible, by attacking its ability to earn. And if the crisis deepens even further, the the United States may not remain alone. Gulf state bases are already positioned to support American operations. The British ship RFA Cardigan Bay and French tripartite-class mine hunters could be brought in. NATO mine countermeasures units and Italian Gaeta-class ships could join a wider effort. Officially, some European governments still maintain that their naval assets would focus on mine clearing only after the war fully ends. But that stance may become harder to sustain if Hormuz stays blocked and Europe's energy exposure grows worse. Trump's pressure on Europe to do more, combined with the direct economic pain of a prolonged crisis, may gradually shift the EU's strategic posture. In the end, Europe may find that neutrality in Hormuz is a luxury it cannot afford. All of this is happening under conditions of extraordinary risk. Hormuz is narrow, shallow, and hostile. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide. That makes it a nightmare environment for any navy operating under threat from shore-based missiles, drones, mines, and small attack craft. Iran has spent years preparing exactly for this kind of asymmetric confrontation. It possesses thousands of suicide drones and hundreds of shore-launched anti-ship missiles capable of threatening large naval platforms moving through confined waters. This is the environment the Revolutionary Guards were built to exploit. They know they cannot beat the U.S. Navy in open battle, but they believe they can make passage through Hormuz so dangerous that the political and economic cost becomes unbearable. That is the theory behind their strategy. And that is what makes any American effort to force open the strait so perilous. One successful strike on an American warship in these waters could change everything. If a destroyer were seriously damaged by a missile, or if an unmanned boat managed to hit a high-value naval target, the crisis could escalate from a regional standoff into something far more global and uncontrollable. Iran knows this. That is why its behavior at the negotiating table has been so uncompromising. On issues like sanctions, nuclear restrictions, and regime survival, Iran has few cards left that it can physically play. But Hormuz is still real. It is still dangerous. It is still capable of disrupting the planet. Tehran understands that letting go of that lever may feel, from the regime's perspective, like letting go of the last thing it has left. That is also why the economic dimension of the crisis matters so much. Oil prices have surged, insurance premiums have multiplied, and ship owners are now paying mine risk premiums to even consider the route. Most tankers are still reluctant to enter the strait. But the problem goes far beyond oil alone. Hormuz is not just a crude corridor. It is a vital passage for natural gas, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and plastic raw materials. If the strait remains clogged, the result is not just more expensive fuel. It is a broad shock to manufacturing, transport, agriculture, construction, and consumer markets worldwide. China, Japan, South Korea, and India all depend heavily on energy flows through Hormuz. If the corridor remains unstable, Chinese industry slows, Japanese refiners burn through reserves, South Korea's petrochemical sector faces rising costs, and India feels direct pressure across its economy. Europe faces the same trap, especially because alternative routes are either more expensive, slower, or already under strain. Yes, ships can try to go around the Cape of Good Hope, but that can mean roughly 10 additional days of travel and a steep rise in fuel costs. The Suez Canal exists, but it is already under pressure and has its own security complications, including threats linked to the Houthis. So this is not a crisis with a clean logistical bypass. It is a crisis that exposes how dangerously dependent the world still is on one narrow strip of water. And if the most optimistic mine clearing estimates are correct, the cleanup could still take months, not days. That means the economic bleeding is unlikely to stop quickly even if the military situation improves. And here lies one of the most striking ironies of the entire situation. Iran's own economy is being hit by the same strategy it thought would save it. Before the war, Tehran was exporting around 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. But those exports also passed through Hormuz. By mining the strait and helping create an environment of chaos, Iran has clogged its own lifeline. The regime is now damaging not only global energy security, but also the very source of income it needs to survive. In that sense, this is not a clean asymmetric masterstroke. It is a self-destructive trap. The longer Hormuz stays compromised, the more Iran accelerates the search for alternative routes, alternative energy strategies, and alternative global supply designs. The more it uses the strait as a trump card, the faster the world starts trying to reduce the value of that card. And then there is the actor standing quietly in the background, benefiting from the crisis more than almost anyone else: Russia. While Tehran sinks deeper into the economic and geopolitical consequences of its own gamble, Moscow is profiting from the panic. Higher oil prices weaken the practical power of the West's price cap strategy on Russian exports. Markets under pressure start bending rules out of necessity. Buyers become more flexible. Revenue flows grow. For a Kremlin still funding a massive war effort in Ukraine, every spike in energy prices is a gift. The crisis in Hormuz does not just raise prices for a few days. It helps funnel money back into Russia's war machine. But Russia's advantage is not limited to short-term oil profits. There is a deeper strategic layer. If Hormuz becomes unreliable and Middle Eastern routes remain dangerous, Russia's long-term Arctic ambitions suddenly look more attractive. The Northern Sea route, a corridor Moscow has spent years trying to develop, becomes more interesting to Asia and Europe when southern routes turn unstable. If enough actors begin taking that route seriously, Russia could gain not only from energy sales, but also from transit fees, Arctic infrastructure relevance, and wider geopolitical leverage. In other words, a crisis triggered in the Gulf could help finance Russian power projection elsewhere, including in the war against Ukraine. Moscow and Beijing are also learning from the military side of this confrontation. Both are watching how far American naval, air, and logistical capacity can be stretched. They are studying force deployments, reaction times, escort patterns, coalition hesitation, and command decisions. The more U.S. resources are drawn into a dangerous and prolonged Gulf operation, the more room Russia and China potentially gain in other theaters. That makes the Hormuz crisis bigger than Iran. It becomes part of a broader global contest in which one region's instability gives strategic space to rival powers elsewhere. That is why this crisis cannot be understood as a simple bilateral standoff. Iran may believe it is resisting the United States and forcing the world to deal with its demands. But in practice, it may be playing a much larger role in a game that benefits others more than itself. The mines, the disruption, the shock to markets, and the strain on Western coordination all create opportunities for Moscow and, in a different way, for Beijing. Tehran may think it is holding the system hostage, but it is also helping reshape that system in ways that could eventually weaken its own position. This is exactly why international support for reopening Hormuz matters so much. If the strait remains solely an arena in which Tehran can manipulate risk and major powers can profit from chaos, then the entire global system becomes more vulnerable. But if a coordinated effort can re-establish safe sea lanes, restore confidence in shipping, and deny Iran the ability to use Hormuz as a permanent weapon, then the strategic balance changes. The question now is whether the world is prepared to act before the crisis hardens into a new and dangerous normal. For now, the pieces are moving fast. American destroyers have already entered the strait. Underwater drones are being prepared. Mine-clearing operations are underway. Trump is openly signaling a doctrine that goes far beyond escort duty. Iran is warning that the next response will be harsher. Europe is under growing pressure. Asia is already feeling the pain. Russia is quietly smiling through the panic. And all of it is unfolding above waters where a single drifting mine or one sudden missile launch could ignite something far bigger than anyone intends. Hormuz is no longer just a choke point. It is becoming the place where military doctrine, energy security, global inflation, and great power competition are colliding all at once. And if Washington really is preparing its final move there, then the next phase will not just decide who controls a strait. It could decide who shapes the next chapter of global order.